Okay. All right. So like, I'll basically, just like I said, introduce the overall panel and then leave you all to go for about 50 minutes. And then we'll go into lunch break.
Woo-hoo. So since I have a PowerPoint here with John, we're going to dump some stuff on the table that John and I'd like to talk about. Then we'll pass it to David and Shannon to dump some more stuff on the table, and we'll hopefully have a great conversation, everybody. Which presumes I can. Okay. So what are we here to talk about today? We're going to just do a quick flash through some pictures to refresh everyone's memory of the last president and his ties to professional wrestling. There's Donald Trump from WrestleMania 4. There he is in WrestleMania 23. There's the moment where he pretended to buy the Raw franchise from Vince McMahon. And as president, there's the connection to the wrestling organization, the wrestling family, made visible for all of us. So it's the idea that this is a lens through which we can view his presidency is not a new one. John and I in the past have written about wrestling rhetoric. If you were here last year, John's a geographer, I'm a rhetorician. We pulled together the notion of the wrestling rhetoric alongside some honest to goodness quantitative data about the relative popularity of wrestling in different regions based on attendance at house shows. And we correlated that against turnout and voting for Trump in the 2016 election. Basically in an attempt to say, hey, it's one thing to say he may talk like a wrestler. It's another thing to say that there's an audience for whom this resonates, right? And trying to do that kind of empirical on the ground number-y thing. We want to say here today that the wrestling rhetoric catches fire after he loses the election of the 2020. And in a very speculative way, we're attempting to talk about whether the great promos of pro wrestling from the brain to, and you're going to have to help me out here. I'm kind of out of date on wrestling. There's somebody called The Miz.
The Miz. Yeah, he's a reality TV star too, married to another pro wrestler.
Can explain Trump's rhetorical moves now. So what we want to do is talk about how after a pro wrestler loses, the promos afterwards basically have 4 dimensions. Number one, the wrestler articulates that they should have won. Almost universally, it seems, the ref was in on it, is complicit in the theft. The wrestler believes that the fans know the truth, even if the referee won't see it, and the wrestler then demands the rematch. And oh, I could spend the rest of my life watching Randy Savage promos. They're poetry and hilarity at the same time. If Carrie, there's a place for us to share the PowerPoints at some point, right? Or maybe not, or you can, all the videos are embedded in the PowerPoint. You can watch them at detail if you want, but I'm wondering, would it be okay to ask for some volunteers to read some of these passages? Build a little interactivity in? Is there an audience member who can sound like this Miz person who I don't know what he sounds like? I mean, I do because I watched the video, but.
All right, I don't definitely have his voice, but after everything I've done for WWE, all the media appearances, interviews, talk shows, reality shows, photo shoots, autograph signings, sleepless nights, endless, thankless tasks, year after year after year, I don't take vacations, I do not get injured, and I successfully defended my WWE championship.
You didn't.
Just unfair.
Oh, no, don't start the video, don't start the video. And we've got a ton of post-election bits from Trump, which say that we've demonstrated that we won the election in a landslide. Almost 75 million people voted for me, the most of any incumbent president in the history of our country. We won over 11 million, 12 million votes, blah, blah, blah. You've heard this stuff before. I won by every metric I won, except of course for the one that mattered. I've had 2 elections. I won both. It's amazing. I actually did win that second one. The fact is we won. We won it big. All these are from one speech. Anyway, more interestingly, I think, is the moments when the wrestler is in on the theft. I guess, John, maybe it's you and me doing some theater here.
Yeah.
The referee had to be biased. No question you were robbed. This is now the second time.
Next time they're going to be carrying you out. And if there's a referee anywhere in sight, they'll be carrying him out.
So, seeking vengeance on the referee. Should have warned you that you'd need to sound like Sergeant Slaughter.
Thank you, Dick.
And then here's the brain.
They brought in an official referee who was supposed to control law and order. As far as I'm concerned, it was 4 against 3.
So again, the ref is in on it. One more, brother.
Never in my wildest dreams would I think that I'd be ripped off by a penny-pinching, two-timing referee. The referee is paid off, brother. Look at the $100 bills falling out of his pocket.
Of course, there were no $100 bills falling out of his pocket. It's the kind of beautiful hyperbole these promos are for. Lastly, this is another more recent wrestler.
No matter how many matches I won, no matter how loud these people cheered for me, you were always right. The machine will never let me win. No matter how loud you people chanted, you chanted yes in every building I've ever been to, and they don't care.
And of course, Trump does the same thing. Everybody, every possible official is in on it, right? Even Republican governors, Republican officials in the various states. It's theft on a scale never seen before. The Democrats, the state Supreme Court judges, the Democrat Secretary of State, everybody contributed to robbing him. I want to pick up on the last line from that last promo from Brian. You chanted yes in every building we've been to, and they don't care, because it's important that for these appeals to work, the wrestler has to look at the audience and say, you know I won, right? You know I won. And there's a ton of that kind of inclusive we language. Dr. Colavito, if I had known a little bit further in advance, I would have tossed some Kenneth Burke in here in terms of that kind of identification language. And then there's the wrestler demanding the rematch. And I thought about putting some quotes in here, but I think the pictures do it just as well. John wants us especially to take a look. I was trying to figure out how do we end this kind of laying of thoughts on the table. And John said to me, well, there's stuff about when a wrestler goes away and returns. And John, would you want to fill us in on some of what you're thinking there?
Yeah, quite often what happens in pro wrestling, like Hogan, he was the biggest star in WWE. He left for WCW. He came back with this different persona, Hollywood Hogan, kind of a bad guy. Going way back, there's all, the territorial days. Somebody wrestles in one territory, he goes away, wrestles in another territory, and then he comes back, right? Often with a new character. Like Adrian Adonis had 2 runs in the WWE, as 2 different characters. He goes away for a while. Bobby Lashley, who was a big part of the WrestleMania 23, worked for Impact Wrestling, the Indies, and now he's back. He came back to WWE. And so the way we think about this, right? Trump is trying to tell his fans he actually won. We are robbed. The refs cheated. There's a scandal against me. The company's rigged against me, right? And there is this thing in pro wrestling where there's a comeback, right? That maybe it gets too played out. The gimmick sometimes gets, worn out, right? And like Hogan went away, right? Other wrestlers go away for a while, and then they come back, and there's this big, it's a big deal when somebody comes back after sometimes years or months, right? So, the indication is that Trump is planning on running again, right? And as you notice, he's not, his Twitter got taken away, right? So, we're speculating. His fans feel he was robbed. They're demanding a rematch, right? And are we going to see a little interregnum, right? Where Trump goes away for a little bit. His fans stew. And let's say starting in 2022 election time or after the 2022 midterms, right? Does he sort of make a comeback to seek vengeance for the wrong. And I suspect a lot of it depends on 2022. If the Republicans make some gains in 2022, if people he backs win primaries at least, I think we could see, a comeback, sort of like they do in pro wrestling, with this spirit of, I'm going to right a wrong. I'm coming back with a vengeance. So,
If you think
And so that's basically what we're calling a speculative paper. We're still working this stuff out. Last year, man, you had retreated to the results of like months and months and months of statistical analysis. And this year, I'm afraid we're in the middle of the project. We're hoping for some great feedback from you and from our fellow panelists.
Okay, Shannon, do you want to go first or should I?
Whichever. Go for it.
I'm thinking your work, because it's based on sort of the rhetoric of Trump, might fit better than mine, which is more sort of abstract theoretical, maybe. I don't know. But
Okay. I really kind of was just going to talk about myself. I was thinking more conversation than actually presentation here. But, I guess building off of the presentation we just saw, some of the things if you've seen my stuff, I got interested in this because I watched wrestling because I wound up stuck in Budapest, Hungary for a year, and it was the only English language program available. And I got a really good education. And then I kind of came back to this because when I started watching him, I studied presidential speeches. Specifically, a lot of my work, I look at where they give speeches. And I started watching this going, and my brain started going, I've seen this before. Where have I seen this? I was like, wrestling. Because what Donald Trump is doing, I think he's done for most of his political career, he's just been borrowing from wrestling. He didn't really get any media training that is separate from wrestling. He became a celebrity and cut his teeth on wrestling. I think it was WrestleMania 4. And by all the accounts I've read, he was just fascinated by it. And I think he became a great student. And I think he embraces the duality of it very well. I think, well, that's also the quote, his experience with, I think WD impacted the way he dealt with Celebrity Apprentice. I mean, I think we see, I did a lot of deep dive into literature and academic literature on some of this. And one of the things I saw with a lot of material is, for example, the more you tell somebody something, the more likely they are to believe it. I found the first reference to that in I think it was like a 1920 piece. Somebody did some research way back in the day, and then Albig published it in the mid-1930s in Public Opinion, which was one of the very, very first books that was ever written on public opinion research. And these are deep standing things in American culture, and Trump exploits them. He exploits these ideas. What troubled me, and the one I wrote about it in the book, it's actually the one where Vince McMahon got blown up in the limousine. And Trump, this was recounted, I think, on an Opie and Andy show. Trump called WWE to see if he was okay. I am deeply concerned about that because that makes me curious about how much does Trump truly understand this as a performance and a construct versus reality. And and for me as an academic who studies politics, that makes me worried about how much he understands his own press or believes his own press or believes the construct of the theatrical narrative. Because a lot of what Trump exploited very well was classic theatrical narrative. And he's very good at delivering it. And he's very good at selling an audience. What I've put in the comments is that he's a classic antagonist. All of his behaviors and mannerisms are antagonistic. I think he longs to be a protagonist, And I think he's settled to be an anti-hero. But he loves to be the person who is everybody is cheering for. But if they won't cheer for him, he wants you to boo for him, because all attention is good attention, I think, in Trump world. And cutting him off from media, from what I've understood from some of the people I know about that know stuff around the presidency, because I know a few people in a few places about a few things. Cutting him off from Twitter has been like, taking him off life support. He has been a very, very unhappy camper. And he is desperate for the attention, and he's desperate for trying to find a way back. And I'm watching the My Pillow guy as extension of this narrative. I mean, I see that guy is pretty much, maintaining these theatrical arcs, because wrestling, as I see it, maintains these theatrical arcs, and then tabula rasa's back, and the theatrical arcs again, and the tabula rasa's often with the storylines. When things don't work, they never existed, and when they do work, you push it forward. But I think he's trying to. I agree with the previous presentation. I think he's trying to wash off all the stuff that didn't work, and he's going to retcon himself, and he's going to try to come on back, as your wrong hero in the fairly near future. But I'll stop babbling at that point. And if you got any questions, or I can chime in anywhere else if you want.
Okay, I'll kick off. I'm afraid I've got sort of a presentation to go forward. It's a little bit more abstract, but hopefully it all ties to everything we're talking about. So I come from a political studies background, and my question has been what my field can learn from professional wrestling studies. So in a recent article for the journal Political Studies Review, which I'm kind of building off of here, I argued that pro wrestling studies has a series of concepts that, operationalized in political studies, can help us gain analytical purchase on key political phenomenon, of which obviously Donald Trump was, you will see, right? The glaring symptom. Specifically, what I argue is the concepts of kayfabe, smart fandom, and marking out help us to address a key question for political scholars studying Trump, which is how to explain the engagement with and the emotional investment in the campaign of such an obvious political fraudster by an allegedly cynical electorate. And I'll lay out the argument now, moving from concepts in term. And basically what I'm coming to is, look, Trump's gone, but I think the insights of pro wrestling for politics remain. Okay, maybe he's not gone, right? So, starting with kayfabe, as you always must. I start with Chow and Lane's definition. Kayfabe refers to the performance of staged and faked events as actual and spontaneous. But of course, kayfabe's developed. We have a new kayfabe, describing a new form of audience engagement, a form that involves, in the first instance, a willing suspension of disbelief. And that's one within which performers, promoters, and the audience all keep kayfabe. I know you know, but what does this mean? For the audience keeping kayfabe, and as the audience is what's key here, it involves their active choice to participate in basic performance conventions. Conventions such as cheering the face, booing the heel, joining in chants. And in doing so, fans aren't simply pretending to be fooled by the game. Rather, everyone's invested in, we're involved in playing the game itself. So it's an active, collaborative relationship. It's a co-production, one where fans both create and they sustain the kayfabe, while simultaneously, absolutely key, we're dissecting it. As fans, we pass the elements of the performance with a discerning eye on how well the performers follow the rules of the performance practices, how they play their role, or we view and interpret the action through the lens of our own presumed knowledge of off-camera events, backstage decision-making. We're basically sort of reading through the fiction to glean those hidden truths. And in doing so, we're participating in what Nevitz called a game of prediction and interpretation, in which we apply understanding of wrestling techniques, character histories, performers, and WWE as a company. So, you know, the questions, why did a booker decide upon that outcome? Will the fact the wrestler is selling the leg play into the finish? Does a promo mean a heel turn's coming? So as fans, the game of interpretation is not about what's real, but rather about what the intention of that fake is, right? So turning back to Trump and politics more generally, right? It's here that the concept of kayfabe may initially prove useful for political scholars. Why? As analysts of politics, we find ourselves studying, first of all, a world increasingly plagued by mass political cynicism, which Simon Critchley describes as a smirking knowingness, because we all know it's a sham, right? It's a world in which politics itself is a dirty world. But it's a world also in which people still pile into political rallies to cheer for the speeches of a politician like Donald Trump, excitedly following and investing emotionally in their political campaign and their presidency. So again, why? And the kayfabe approach I've been trying to work out offers one explanation for such sort of an irrational phenomenon. And it does so by viewing the relationship between wrestling fans and WWE programming as analogous to the relationship between politician supporters and their political campaigns. And such an approach, I hope, can explain why a cynical public can invest in a political show they know to be at some level artificial. I mean, after all, right, when a politician stages a rally in a particular city, voters know that they do so for specific ends on the basis of specific calculations about its effect. E.g., we need to carry the Rust Belt, a rally here will increase turnout. But as Timpson describes beautifully, and I've got a lovely quote here, those who attend the rally choose to participate in the spectacle of the campaign as though it were unmediated by political machinations, all while recognizing and accepting the presence of those machinations, or even taking the machinations themselves as the object of interest. And for me, adopting kayfabe as a conceptual lens explains why. Pro wrestling fans, are always in the process of becoming insiders, learning the rules of the game, getting smart how the business works. That's the very process really that sustains the new kayfabe. In the realm of political campaigning, a similar process is at play. We don't merely interact with the event naively, we actively interpret it as insiders would. We know the candidate's declaration of love for our city is made with the intention of winning votes. We know the public eating of our local delicacy staged, so the babies kissed are not necessarily the cutest as exclaimed. We know that behind the candidates, a team of scriptwriters, campaign managers, brand consultants, all of whom help shape the speech of the candidate that we're cheering. And moreover, we're actively interpreting these elements. We know what happens off camera, but we either discount it as unimportant, or we produce hypotheses about what it may be and how it shapes what we can see. After all, we've read the blogs, we've listened to the podcast, we know how things work. So our interest in this field, in this sphere, as such, is not in distinguishing between real and performed actions. The interest in the intention behind the choice of the performed actions themselves. Why campaign in the city? Why raise the issue in a speech? Why not raise the issue in a speech? Yet even as we ask these questions, as supporters, we still suspend disbelief. And like the audience, I'd say at a pay-per-view, we cheer, we boo as if we're affirming something real. And that leads me on to the second element. Just follow along with me. And that's the distinction between smart fans, those who know pro wrestling is a work, and the marks, those who allegedly don't. So how does that build on this? Going back to Nevitt, he describes spectators of pro wrestling as, quote, divided in their own minds into smarts and marks, but the marks are always other people. The process of becoming insider is a progression from smart to even smarter. The state of being a mark is always in the past. Now, in the paper at this point, I dive into this sort of the political theorist Slavoj Žižek's ideas of enlightened false consciousness, ideological cynicism, all of which I think fits nicely here. I'll skip over it now, obviously, because of time to get to the discussion. And just jump to that idea that despite differentiating themselves from imagined marks, the reality is all smart fans, right? We retain the overt knowledge that the core wrestling narrative relies to a large degree on successfully performing as dupes who are not in on the con. Or in other words, to retain the dramatic appeal, pro wrestling requires smarts to perform as marks when attending events, just as a successful rally requires attendees cheer, they chant, they perform the roles as believing supporters. So just very briefly using that Žižekian formulation of ideological cynicism, smarts know very well what they're doing, but still they are doing it. And that takes me on to the next step in the argument, because I want to argue it's that cynical distancing that underpins this sort of epistemology of smartdom, whether pro wrestling or politics, that works to smooth the consumption of underpinning ideological messages. The relationship between the smart fan and the performance, it's premised upon the former seeming critical deconstruction, right, of the content of the performance. We're breaking it down critically. As Nevitt describes, that means smart spectators subsequently think that because I'm not a mark, I must already be critically aware of the way the performance works. Yet, being smart requires the ability to actively think like the wrestlers, the producers, and the performers themselves. That insider knowledge, it constitutes the very capital that allows us to take part in the game of interpretation and storyline and match prediction, which is what underpins pro wrestling fandom largely. The implication, however, is that audience members learn to interpret within a particular framework of rules, a framework that structures subsequent reception of information. And simultaneously, it also focuses interpretation on uncovering the intention of a performance, the sort of hidden logic behind it, rather than critically questioning substantive content of the performance. And at this bit in the paper, I dive into how I adapt this idea of the logic of the booker to the field of politics, go into sort of how political media works and so forth. Skipping that discussion, again due to time, I just note that in political studies, the dominant communication style that frames political performances, it's what we call strategic game framing, focusing on winners and losers, massive campaign strategy, horse race coverage, and it establishes a set of performance conventions which are deemed normal, which subsequently shape our interpretive practices of politics. Conventions that, if not followed, create bemusement and annoyance that politics is being done wrong, often sidelining the actual substantive content of the politics that is falling outside of that. However, I sort of going to my final point, evidence suggests that framing politics as a game of strategy, it increases cynicism and it decreases political participation, right? Fair enough, the evidence is all around us. But how then do we explain not simply the active engagement of Trump supporters with his campaign, aka the fact they turned up to rallies, they kept kayfabe in the sort of cynically distant manner I'm talking about, but the enthusiasm and the passion with which they did so, passion that's even taken them into the halls of the US Capitol building. And useful in bridging this conundrum, I think, is a final concept I'm seeking to import into political studies, and that's the concept of marking out. As noted in pro wrestling terminology, you know, the mark's the rube, someone taken in by the performance, believing it's true. But while reveling in insider knowledge, smart fans maintain a desire for the comfort and pleasure of the mark. To quote Ford, what smart fans constantly strive for is losing themselves in the performance, so we momentarily forget we're playing a role, that is, we mark out. And in the world of the new kayfabe, where everyone self-conceives as smart and thus is in on the work, eliciting those moments where emotion overrides critique, it's the central goal of performance promoters. Pro wrestlers are emotion inducers. And this emotional inducement obviously goes beyond the ring. It's the arena, the rally, the fireworks, the entrance music. And studies of pro wrestling crowds obviously show how membership allows spectators to experience and enjoy releasing emotions in a manner otherwise socially unavailable to them. And in politics also, I am arguing, emotional engagement is increasingly seen as a key motivation for political participation in general. Trump's rallies clearly engage supporters' emotions. His excessive, hyperbolic, morally simplistic, antagonistic style reached excessive heights required for people to mark out. The crowd at the Trump rally occupies a space in which it was socially acceptable to emote, screaming, shouting, cheering for your country, your candidate, openly expressing hatred for political opponents. In short, what Trump managed to do as a campaigner and a politician was to provide a space where even the most cynical of voters might lose themselves in the moment to mark out, become that believing voter with all the enjoyment it entails. So summarizing, I've argued viewing the relationship between politicians and electors through the lens of the new kayfabe illuminates this co-performative relationship, one that drives an active suspension of disbelief, which, while predicated on maintaining a cynical distance as part of so-called self-defined smart supporters, it actually facilitates an intellectual and even emotional engagement with political campaigns and the transmission of ideological messages. While Trump's the perfect product for this analysis, it's how I got my foot in the door, so to speak. What I hope also might be seen is that this approach sort of harmonizes with a general system of representative politics generally defined by widespread patterns of political disengagement and disillusionment. So Trump may be gone, but politics as kayfabe remains, performance conventions have changed, but smart attitudes have been sort of maintained. So there's a bit of a speech at you, but I hope that worked. I'm done.
I'm ready for the antagonistic questions part of the session. David, I have a question, which I chatted in the side, but I want to toss it up here. Because one of the things I'm trying really hard to think about, when I go to wrestling matches with John, I rarely go as a fan of the wrestlers anymore. When I was a kid, I had favorite wrestlers, 48 years old now. I go to local wrestling shows in a city 175 miles from here. I'm just a wrestling fan, but I'm not a fan of a wrestler.
Mm-hmm.
As I think about the people who are interested in Trump, right? They are fans of a wrestler, but they are definitely not fans of the game. Does that make sense? Or if the game is politics, they're not fans of the game. I'm trying to figure out how to take the analogy to account for the voter who really wants Trump to win, but who claims to despise participation in the political system.
So I'd say that it's not necessarily about being a fan of the game. It's the manner in which you engage with the game. which is to say, it's the idea that you enter into the engagement of the performance with the notion that, well, I understand how the system works because I have knowledge and background about how the system works. And that knowledge might be from reading QAnon boards, right? Or it might actually be from reading the Wall Street Times or something like this. But the point is, you've got some idea of how it sort of works. So you're watching it, and you're reading through, I see why they're doing that. I understand how this works. And that might be, I can hear the dog whistle for something, or it might be, I can see they're bridging out of the thing. So it's more that idea. I mean, if you look at how alt-right supporters of Trump went about interpreting some of his work, they did a similar kind of attempt to analyze, drilling into some of his messages, going, actually what you have to understand is when he says that, it's actually saying that he supports white supremacy, it's sort of, so it's happening on sort of both sides there. So it might well be that they understand that politics is rigged because that's the framework they're coming from. And therefore, when you're interpreting the performance, you're interpreting it through how all of this is demonstrating that it's rigged. If that makes sense. Am I suggesting it's all about the game and how you play it? Thank you, Steve. Yeah.
Well, I would say, I think it's because I think part of it's Trump went into these markets, when I posted in the chat, he went into places that most politicians never go. He went to Mankato, Minnesota. The only reason I know Mankato exists is from Little House on the Prairie. And it's got 46,000 television households. It's ranked 198 out of 210 media markets in the United States. They had to fly him in on a chopper. He went to these places that feel ignored by the United States. I'm sorry, by the United States and the United States politics. He went in, I pulled my data set up real quick. He went into Great Falls, Montana. He went into Belgrade, Montana. He went to more small places in the United States than we've seen any other American president in recent memory. And I think these people felt listened to. A lot of people who felt ignored. The way he speaks, the way he interacts with the public, I think a lot of America felt that they were finally being listened to. Now, one of the things I complain about with my classes is I'm in my late 40s, and the people, particularly in the Democratic Party, who were running politics when I was in high school are still in charge. And I think that leads to a lot of disconnect for a large amount of the American public for engagement. And Trump gave them an avenue for engagement. And I think he used the tactics of wrestling to resonate and connect with them. At least that's what I think.
Yeah, David and I've done research. When we looked at attendance at WWE events at a per capita basis, Bemidji, Minnesota, Saginaw, Michigan, Danville, Illinois, had the highest per capita attendance, like per 1,000, right? And I think part of the reason why, WWE is like a major league event. If the NFL came to Mankato, Minnesota for a regular season game, it would sell out within minutes, right? And so when Trump comes to these smaller markets, right, where no other politician comes to, it's also, like you're saying, they see us as important, and there's going to be a disproportionate attendance, right? And I made this point in chat. In some ways, Trump is a throwback to politics as entertainment, right? In the American South, people like Huey Long in the 20s and 30s, when he would come to a small town in Louisiana, they would set up speakers, a sound system, right? In pre-television, right? A politician coming to town, putting on a good show, that was big time entertainment for the folks, just as if Huey Long was giving a speech in New Orleans.
Yeah, I mean, there's this book, I was pulling up, double check. There's a book by Stan Greenberg. He did it in the early 90s called Middle Class Dreams. And he was trying to figure out how all these Michigan Democrats voted for Ronald Reagan. And he did a bunch of focus groups. And what he found out, and what the book's about, is they didn't agree with any of his politics. They just liked him. And I think there's a lot of that phenomena going on with these populations because they feel like somebody's listening to them. When we actually look at the numbers for what a lot of the people that voted for Trump said what they liked, there's a lot of people who are like fans, But there's a lot of people who are like, well, I don't really like all those policies, but I feel like I'm being listened to. And I think there's a lot of power there. And I think he really resonated with a lot of people in that regard.
Yeah, I
if
agree.
can
A
jump-
common theme is many white voters feel that the country's leaving them behind, right? That the country's changing, and he's the only one who's still listening to them.
Yeah, jumping in on that, it's from another paper I wrote, which was comparing Trump with Ventura's campaign. Sort of, for me, when I talk about popularity and so forth, it's that idea of the politeiner, right? He's someone who was a celebrity who went into politics, but he didn't break character. He never went, okay, now I'm sort of, I'm a politician, make myself. He was playing the role he played in the WWE, that he played in The Apprentice, that he played when he was in Pizza Hut commercials and, little Miss Will pageants, and he just continues through. And the reason that really matters is it allows him to get away with saying things and doing things and acting in ways that a professional politician can't. He can say certain things which, I imagine people have seen the truly awful Live on Raw, where they got Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and John McCain to talk. And they do the whole, I'm going to lay the smack down. And it's appalling because they can't do it because these are professional politicians. But Trump, Ventura, they can say these things and they get laughs and shucks and it's fun. And it symbolizes they're outsiders. It symbolizes that they're not part of the system, that they're playing by different rules and should be understood differently. Yeah.
Well, I had a couple thoughts. I'm tying on that. There's actually some political science research. The one off the top of my head is Shaw and Sparrow in '99, just because I had to cite it for some stuff recently. But the smaller the media market you go into for presidential speeches, the more positive the media coverage is. So because the small markets are so much like, oh my gosh, he's coming here, they're not critical. And so I think Trump really reacts well to that. He wants the adulation. He wants the love. And he likes going into the smaller places because he gets a lot of really positive feedback there. And sometimes I see it as a self-reinforcing loop. And one thing I wanted to draw back to wrestling with, I saw the thing about the whiteness in the comments, is one of the things I've been surprised when I've gone to wrestling matches is just how diverse actually I've seen audiences, especially here in Austin, Texas. Is that we talk in the literature and we talk about politics and how Trump is really resonating with just the white population. But when I go to wrestling, it's very diverse. And I think there's a disconnect between the actual audiences of wrestling and then the public perception of who attends wrestling. And that's all I wanted to say about that. So.
It occurs to me, Carrie's been posting some kind of questions about the implications of this kind of thinking or this kind of research. And I want to pick up those questions and spin them in a certain kind of way, which is to say, one of the things that I'm suddenly very anxious about in this panel is that we're not actually studying wrestling. We're using wrestling as a lens to study something else. And there are certain kinds of implications for that, right? And I'm wondering if that's worth having a 30-second discussion about in the context of the Professional Wrestling Studies Association, in the context of the implications. What if we unlock the secrets to terrible political action and share them with the world right? And are the negative implications for that? I'm stopping there. Yep.
No, I think, I think you make a good point. We had the earlier panel, legitimacy to pro wrestling studies, right? Why is this important? Well, I think we're demonstrating why it is important. We see someone use the gimmicks, the tropes, the methods of pro wrestling to get elected president of the United States, a person who I think most of us feel is horribly unqualified and not fit for the office. But by using pro wrestling, its methods, its means, its interactions with the audience, he got elected president of the United States, right? So going back, if we want to hook in why is this important, I think we're demonstrating why it is.
Carrie, are you moderating, or should I call on this Kit person, or how do we do this? Hi, Kit. You have something to say?
Yeah, David, to your question, I think this, to put it in a rhetorical perspective, your question is, do we accept what would essentially be a neo-Aristotelian approach to our work or not? And I think the answer is no. We have to ask that question of, okay, this is what they're doing, but for us to not have not essentially release the demons into the world, a playbook of evil, there must be in our scholarship that layer of what are the consequences and what power structures are being challenged or reinforced, and that's important.
But what I say, I will jump in. What I see with wrestling, and I wrote a little about this in my book, is I see it actually as trying to look at actually very, very deep things of particularly historical culture, because wrestling kind of came out of circus, which came out of theater. And all of the archetypes and the interactions. And I only wrote a little bit about it, but I really did a deep dive into like the Spring of Nations, 1848 democratization revolutions in Europe. And that's the point where audiences stopped interacting with theater, like Shakespearean performances, regular theater performances, there used to be a lot of audience interaction, and they shut all of that down because of fear of excessive democratization. They didn't want too much democracy from the audience because they were a little afraid it was going to happen. So they shut all that down and they turned the audiences into these passive observers. And because of, I think, where wrestling wound up going in terms of coming from theater, but then going into circus, which maintained a lot of interactivity to a degree, and then becoming its own thing, it's never thrown off the passivity, or it never threw off the interactivity and embraced the passivity of audience. And in some ways, I find it's fascinating about, is it really like this place of very deep culture of like audience interaction and democratization and how people interact with this? And is that why it's resonating? Is because this is something that a lot of us crave. I'll stop. I'm just sort of spitballing.
Yeah, in regards to, somebody made a comment about kayfabe, we talk about the Trump followers. I mean, I think the language, are they smart marks, right, is another way to look at his voters, his followers. And my suspicion, via Fox News, conservative talk radio, message boards, I think his most fervent supporters see themselves as smarks in some ways. That's sort of my view on his supporters.
If I can build on that, yeah. So one of the questions I had when it's on the paper is, why do you talk about smart fans rather than smarks, right? But for me, when I think of the word smark, I'm thinking that sort of the Brian Pillman smart marks, and it's almost like it's smarts they're marking out for themselves, right? And that element, I think, is what you're getting at there, John. That idea of you are a mark for yourself as a smart. And again, it's that idea of, you can see, and I would also say there's a Trump smark, okay, but there's also a Joe Biden smark. It's just a different type of thing. It's people who still, they love the smell of their own sort of expertise and how they interpret things. But yeah, I think there's something to do there.
Yeah, another thing, I mean, we also have to realize Trump won because a lot of his voters were not necessarily smarks. They weren't red hot believers. He got the support in 2016 and even in 2020, even though there was some erosion of what you would call the Wall Street Republicans, the Main Street Republicans, the libertarian types, where they saw him as the vehicle for their policies. Right. So I think, there's also another aspect. If you're in political geography, political science, we need also the non-smart marks, right? Who voted for him I think is another. I mean, there are people who probably hate pro wrestling, who think it's the stupidest thing ever, right? Or think it's only for kids, and they probably voted for Trump too.
For me, the thing which just dumped me down this hole, sorry, and I'll be very quick, because it's that moment in professional wrestling where someone's down to the 3 count and you see the person in the crowd and they're just shouting, kick out. And that person knows that shouting isn't actually going to make any difference. They understand the relationship here, but you can't help it. And there's something ideologically incredibly interesting there. And it's what led me down to this idea of, well, what's the equivalent when you're investing in politics? That moment in which you go, yeah, obviously, politics is sort of rigged in some sense, but actually, do you know what? And it's the ability to bring that emotion out, to bring that attachment out, which I think is something which Trump manages to do, as well as, of course, having the people who just go, well, I don't like him at all, but I'll get what I want via him. But yeah.
We've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to leap in real quick and say, as I think back to the conversation before this one, I'm suddenly becoming very interested in a collection which would say, here are the theories and models that wrestling studies has built, and here's how those things explain things which aren't wrestling, as a way of producing both a kind of field validation and producing just a reasonable body of interesting work.
Yeah, which brings us to 2020, right? Are his smart marks within the Republican Party enough to get him the nomination, right? And let's say he gets the nomination, he loses, he can still say, I was robbed, I was cheated. So in one way, in Trump's mind and in his supporters, if we use the wrestling rhetoric, he won. Even though he didn't win the election, he's not necessarily a loser, which I think Trump hates more than anything else if you read about him. He hates being called a loser. He lost the election, but he's not a loser, and hence his supporters are not losers because it was stolen from them, right? The ref was in on it. And I think that's also an important aspect if we look at it. But I guess my prediction is I think he wins, going out 3 years, 4 years, I think he can win the Republican nomination based on his following, at least. And I'm not going to speculate beyond that. So.
I really want to be able to hold you accountable for whatever you say here. So come on. 11:55. I think we're done, right?
Yeah.